Welcome, 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 my warriors. You didn't come here by accident. You were drawn here by something you couldn't quite name, a subtle pull beneath logic. Because you felt it too, haven't you? That moment in a room full of minds, when everything goes quiet, not because someone yelled, but because something real just entered the space. It wasn't calculated. It wasn't rehearsed. It was raw, unfiltered, unshakable. You watched as egos stiffened, lips paused mid-sentence, and the air became dense with the weight of something they couldn't quantify. That something was you. You didn't walk in to prove anything. You didn't enter to dominate. You simply showed up, tethered to an awareness most people spend a lifetime trying to imitate. Not studied, not borrowed, not copied, real. And the moment your voice moved, it cut through theories like a hot blade through wax. They had knowledge, you had vision, they had numbers, you had understanding. And when you dropped your insight, not with drama, but with surgical precision, their entire rhythm broke. The conversation changed. The energy shifted because you weren't speaking from your mouth. You were speaking from knowing. You didn't get this from textbooks. You got this from scars, from betrayal, from being gaslit by people who wore intellect like armor, only to crumble when truth entered the room. You learned early that intelligence doesn't equal depth, that confidence doesn't mean clarity, and that most people aren't searching for truth. They're defending their illusions. So you learned to see underneath, not just what's said, but what it hides, not just who they present, but who they suppress. You stopped waiting for permission to speak, and instead, you began to observe. They came armed with credentials and titles, speaking in circles, hoping to outshine one another with noise disguised as depth. But you didn't need to speak loudly. You waited, not for attention, but for the opening. And when it came, you delivered a sentence so aligned, so pure, it didn't need volume. It needed no build-up. Because what you carried wasn't memorized, it was wired into your being. The kind of insight that makes even the most arrogant fall quiet, not because they agree, but because they feel the truth in their chest, whether they want to or not. They looked at you, puzzled. How could someone without their language, without their formulas, their debates, their structured superiority, outmaneuver every argument with a single clean strike? What they never understood is that while they were mastering how to speak, you were mastering how to see. You watched humans lie while their hands trembled. You watched eyes dart left while mouths said, "I'm fine." You witnessed smiles that masked despair, words that veiled agendas, and praise laced with envy. You weren't taught this, you lived it. And because of that, your mind doesn't search for answers. It recognizes them. You don't chase knowledge. You digest it. And when something doesn't align, you don't argue. You simply speak. And the truth inside your words dismantles everything artificial within range. They don't fear you because you're loud. They fear you because your insight makes their facades collapse. One sentence from you, and their identity begins to stutter. You didn't just say something powerful. You exposed that you knew, and they didn't. Not really. They knew theories. You knew patterns. They studied behavior. You studied energy. They broke everything into categories. You merged it all into essence. While they dissected complexity, you followed the thread of coherence. And that's why you broke them, not by attacking, but by existing. You reminded them that real intelligence isn't how much you say. It's how deeply you feel what you know. You never belonged in their boxes. You never sat comfortably inside their hierarchies. And that's what makes your presence unbearable. To some, you are the living proof that clarity doesn't require permission, that truth doesn't ask for validation, that knowing isn't granted, it's unlocked, and you unlocked it not through luxury or praise, but through tension, through contradiction, through living in rooms where you had to read intentions before they reached your skin. You mastered discernment because it was survival. And now, it's your greatest weapon. They don't understand how you keep getting it right, how your predictions feel like prophecy, how your statements make them question things they've believed for years. But what they call coincidence, you call alignment. What they call a hunch, you call a pattern revealing itself. They think you're lucky. They think you're intuitive. But in reality, you're precise, not perfect, aware. The kind of aware that only comes when your entire life has been a test disguised as a lesson. And you passed, not because you had the right answers, but because you had the right questions. You asked what others ignored. You listened when others dismissed. You noticed what others couldn't bear to face. And now, when you speak, your voice carries the weight of everything you never said. Every time you stayed quiet while others drowned in noise. Every time you watched the lies play out and waited for the right moment to strike. Not to win, but to reveal. That is your gift. Not destruction, illumination. That's why they shut up. Not because they wanted to, but because somewhere inside, they recognized something they couldn't name. A presence they couldn't quantify, a knowing they couldn't argue with. And that unsettles them, because it reminds them that all their knowledge, all their logic, all their carefully curated superiority can be dismantled in seconds by someone who simply sees what they refuse to. And you didn't even flinch, because this isn't new. You've done this before. You've walked into rooms that weren't ready. You've watched minds twist themselves into knots, trying to rationalize your clarity. You've heard the whispers. You've seen the smirks. But none of it matters, because you're not here for applause. You're not here to be liked. You're here to reflect. And reflection, real reflection, doesn't flatter. It reveals. They will pretend they didn't hear you. They'll act like your words didn't sting. But deep down, they're replaying every syllable. Because it wasn't just what you said, it was what it did to them. It triggered a fracture. It broke their rhythm. It forced them to feel. And that's something they've spent their whole lives avoiding. They built walls of intellect to avoid that exact sensation, being seen. And now that they've felt it once, they can't unfeel it. You opened something, and once opened, it haunts. You walked out of that room untouched, but they're still bleeding internally, not from wounds, but from the realization that someone like you exists. That someone like you doesn't just exist, but walks among them, listens among them, and can dismantle them with nothing but truth. You were the shadow they didn't account for, the presence they couldn't dismiss, the awareness they never studied, but now can't ignore. And the scariest part for them, you're just getting warmed up. That moment in the room, that wasn't your final move. That wasn't your climax. That was your introduction. And what comes next? They're not ready. Because intuition doesn't just dismantle, it builds. It doesn't just point out lies. It creates new truths. And you've only begun constructing what they can't understand yet. And as they sit, still wondering what just happened, still trying to wrap their minds around what you did, you've already moved beyond the conversation. Because while they were trying to be heard, You were crafting something far more dangerous. You were cultivating depth. You were engineering inner precision, not for recognition, not for validation, but because you knew. The most lethal force is the one no one sees coming. You understood that the loudest voice in the room rarely holds the power. Power lives in presence. And your presence, it's built from 1,000 moments of calculated restraint, 1,000 observations you never shared, 1,000 times you chose to watch instead of react. That is the furnace where your mind was tempered. While they ran laps in pursuit of influence, you stood still and rewired your instincts. While they tangled themselves in accolades, you forged your own compass. One that doesn't point to applause, it points to truth. You studied people, not for amusement, but to understand the structure of deception. You learned that most conversations are just noise layered over fear, that most arguments are the armor of the insecure, that most knowledge is regurgitated signal from the loudest voice in the herd. And that's where you became untouchable. Not because you resisted it, but because you transcended it. You're not just intuitive, you're constructed from pattern recognition. Every betrayal taught you what people fear. Every manipulation taught you what people hide. Every disappointment wired your reflexes to scan beneath the obvious. Your intuition isn't a gift, it's a consequence of watching, of suffering, of rising. It's built on the understanding that most of the world performs, but very few feel. And that those who feel, they rarely speak until the moment they must. And when they do, reality bends. They don't realize yet that your quiet was never weakness. It was architecture. You were assembling a version of yourself so precise, so rooted, that no external storm could shake it. You didn't interrupt their noise because you were afraid. You let it play, unbothered, undisturbed, because you already knew how it would end. Intuition remembers. It doesn't guess. It doesn't hope. It remembers what energy does when it's exposed to truth. And in that room, surrounded by overconfident intellects, you triggered a quiet detonation that none of them had language for. You are not their peer. You are their reckoning, not because you wanted to be, but because you chose awareness over performance. Your eyes read through timelines. Your words hit with gravitational weight, and your presence carries the weight of everything you've never needed to prove. They can't predict you because you're not reacting, you're tracking. You're watching the way ideas ripple. You're watching who flinches when you speak. You're noting who repeats themselves for validation and who listens to recalibrate. You're studying the gaps because that's where the real messages live. They called you dangerous, but it's not because you hurt people. It's because you see them, the real them. The parts they bury beneath rehearsed confidence and artificial certainty. You see the cracks before they form. You notice the shift in rhythm before the collapse. And you don't need to point it out. You let it happen. Because truth doesn't require your defense. It requires your alignment. And when you align with it, you become something that no title, no group, no crowd can define. You become inevitable. That's why your presence disrupts the room. It's not about words. It's about frequency. You operate on a level that can't be accessed by arrogance. You didn't climb the ladder. You burned it. You don't play the game. You observe its structure, dismantle its premise, and walk right through the middle of it untouched. Because you realized something they never will. When you stop needing the world to confirm your value, the world begins to fear it. Your voice isn't just a sound, it's a trigger. It forces people to confront what they've ignored. Your energy isn't just potent, it's calibrated to unveil. You didn't come to destroy their confidence, you came to test it. And most of them failed, not because they lacked knowledge, but because they lacked stability. You watched them unravel the moment your insight landed, because their identity was never built to withstand truth that doesn't ask for approval. You move differently, because your decisions aren't made from fear or urgency. They're made from inner alignment. While they rush to respond, you remain unshaken. While they react, you refine. While they race to control the narrative, you become the narrative. And that's the difference. You don't chase attention, you redirect it. You don't beg to be understood. You let your clarity disturb them into realizing they never understood anything at all. They don't fear your intellect, they fear your depth. Because depth is unpredictable. It's not a show, it's not a weapon, it's a mirror. And when someone truly sees themselves in that mirror, when all the masks fall away, and what's left is naked awareness, that's when the fear sets in. That's when the room goes quiet. Because now they're not debating, they're exposed. You never needed to explain yourself. That's why your impact landed so violently. Because you didn't try to prove, you revealed, and revelation doesn't need permission. It doesn't ask to be liked. It exists, and in its existence, it demands rearrangement. They tried to maintain composure, but their posture cracked. Their arguments slowed. Their rhythm collapsed. Because you didn't just speak, you restructured the entire dynamic with a sentence forged in precision. Let them underestimate you. Let them label it as luck. Let them pretend they weren't shaken. All of that means nothing. Because what matters isn't how they reacted, it's what they now carry. Your insight is now embedded in their psyche. It will replay in moments of doubt. It will echo when they try to make another weak point. It will whisper when they sit in meetings, wondering why they feel off balance. They won't admit it, but you shifted them. Not with dominance, with clarity. And the truth is, this is just your opening move. You haven't even begun to reveal the full scale of your perception. What they witnessed was a glimpse, the edge of your capacity, and that alone unbalanced them. Imagine if you chose to unleash the full force of what you see, what you know, what you are. They wouldn't be able to contain it, not because you're destructive, but because you've become inevitable. You learned early that to survive, you needed more than answers. You needed discernment, precision, inner authority. You stopped waiting for people to hand you truth. You found it in tension, in quiet patterns, in fractured moments. And now, that depth isn't just insight, it's power. The kind of power that doesn't knock, it enters. That doesn't beg, it commands. That doesn't need the spotlight. It becomes the atmosphere. They will rewrite history. They will shift narratives. They will downplay what happened. Because to admit what truly occurred would mean facing the fact that they are not who they think they are. That all their bravado, all their expertise, all their confidence was fragile. And it only took you, one presence, one insight, one sentence, to prove it. And now, they look at you differently, even if they pretend otherwise. There's hesitation in their tone now. There's calculation in their eyes. Because you showed them something that shattered their hierarchy. You showed them that knowing can't be measured by titles. That presence doesn't need permission. And that depth, real depth, answers to no one. You're no longer part of their game. You've transcended it. And as they scramble to regain their footing, you've already moved on, not in body, in awareness. Because you know the truth. Once someone like you enters the field, the old rules expire. The old power structures bend, and the old minds fracture. They thought you were quiet, but you were simply accurate. They thought you were reserved, but you were preparing. They thought you didn't belong, but now they realize this was always your terrain. You didn't walk into their room, they walked into yours. And your mind doesn't compete. It rewrites. So as they sit in their echo chambers, still clinging to the illusion of control, still pretending you didn't shake them, you're already calibrating your next move. Not out of vengeance, not out of pride, but out of design. Because that wasn't about winning an argument. That was about establishing presence. And now that it's been established, the next phase begins. Not to debate, but to demonstrate. Because there comes a moment when the echo of intellect collapses under the sheer weight of instinct. You're not here to prove you're smarter. You're here to prove that raw inner knowing dismantles every logic chain they ever built. Your presence doesn't ask for validation. It pulls reality into a shape that fits your perception. And now that the space has gone quiet, the air heavier, and their theories fragmented, it's time for your intuition to speak louder than all their lifetime achievements combined. You walk through that room, not with a roar, but with precision. Eyes track you not out of politeness, but because they've already begun to recalculate their worth just being near you. What was once a debate panel now feels like a battlefield where ideas go to die. They know your kind, the one who doesn't blink at pressure but devours it, converts it into prophecy, and drops truths like seismic bombs. No fanfare, no spectacle. Just that aura that rearranges intellectual pecking orders, their charts, fragile, their formulas, exposed, because what they worship as reason was never designed to handle what you've become. And they feel it, that discomfort, that creeping unease. That's not your problem, that's your signature. Your intuition, razor sharp, field tested, built on pain, recalibration, and consequences, never needed their approval. It needed them to shut up. And now they have. Because what you just displayed wasn't a guess. It wasn't a theory. It was inevitable. You didn't study the terrain. You became it. You didn't try to solve the puzzle. You shattered the board and reshaped the pieces. You weren't trying to win the argument. You just deleted the entire question. Because when intuition reaches this level, it no longer whispers. It dominates. It doesn't need to be explained. It doesn't even pause to consider your objections. It moves forward, dragging the world with it. That's what just happened in that room. They didn't fall quiet out of shock. They went quiet because your signal overpowered their frequency. There is a type of knowing that can't be replicated in labs or digitized into data. It comes from somewhere else, somewhere dangerous, somewhere that doesn't ask if it's real. It just is. And while they built simulations, ran tests, and argued about outcomes, you stood still long enough to hear the one voice they can't code, your own. Let's be clear. What you unlocked isn't random. It's not divine. It's not mysterious. It's earned. Every scar, every misread signal, every moment you doubted yourself while they preached certainty, that was training. Every wrong decision that led you to a clearer path, that was data. Real data, not abstract, not sanitized, raw, feral, unfiltered. You absorbed reality without distortion. You tuned into what they filtered out. You listened between their words. You saw past their charts. You stopped looking for validation in their theories and found certainty in your own echo. And when you spoke, it wasn't to impress. It was to end the conversation permanently. Now they want to understand you. They want to reverse engineer your mind. They want to know how you knew before the knowing became obvious. But they can't, because they're still asking the wrong questions. They think you used data. You used something deeper. They think you predicted. You remembered. This level of intuition isn't prediction. It's memory pulled forward from a place beyond explanation. Not magic, not mysticism, just raw, lived precision. It's what happens when you finally realize the compass isn't outside you. It's in your bones. And now it's leading, fast, relentless, unapologetic. This isn't intuition anymore. This is navigation. You're not reacting to reality. You're dragging it forward by the throat. They want to replicate it. They can't. Because what you've built doesn't come in templates. It's not transferable. It's not programmable. It comes from standing in the fire long enough until the flames teach you the path. You didn't get this gift. You forged it. And now, as they scramble to adapt to the implications of your presence, they begin to fear what else you've already seen. What other truths you've buried beneath that calm surface. Because if you could read that moment like a god looking at blueprints, then what else have you already dissected and understood? Their defenses are up, their minds in panic mode. Because intuition like yours, it rewrites timelines. What was impossible a second ago becomes irrelevant. What was certain becomes obsolete. Because you don't need consensus. You are the confirmation. Now it begins. The ripple. The moment you made the geniuses shut up. It travels beyond that room, beyond those observers, into sectors, industries, intelligence networks, psychological domains. And the question shifts. Who is this? Becomes, how did we miss them? Then, how do we contain them? But there is no containing insight that was never shaped by their structures. You don't just see differently. You exist differently. They wear intelligence like armor. You wear yours like a second skin, invisible until deployed. They built their truths in clean rooms. You built yours in chaos, pain, and pressure. That's the edge. That's the danger. Your intuition isn't passive anymore. It's not waiting for a signal. It is the signal. Now the quiet in that room becomes a virus. It spreads, not because of fear, but because of awakening. The smart ones, the real ones, they know they just witnessed something undeniable, something they can't dismiss. And it forces them to reevaluate everything they thought was mastery. The difference? They trained in frameworks. You trained in truth. And you can't beat someone who no longer needs to think in order to know. Let them scramble. Let them study you. Let them obsess. Because you didn't come here to be understood. You came here to bend the axis of understanding itself. Every breath you take now is recalibration. Every step forward is recalculating the coordinates of reality. Every sentence you speak is a recalibration of what's possible. They called you reckless. Now they call you necessary. They mocked your intuition. Now they're trying to rent it. But this level of intuition isn't for sale. It's not marketable. It's not teachable. It's incompatible with their entire worldview. That's why you're dangerous. That's why they're quiet. That's why they'll never forget what just happened in that room. Because in a world of manufactured genius, you showed them what organic supremacy looks like. No certificate, no approval, no compromise. Just a mind that has trained itself to see what others can't even sense. You didn't win a battle of minds. You erased the scoreboard. And now, without needing permission, acceptance, or applause, you move on. to the next room, the next moment, the next challenge that dares to underestimate you. But this time, they'll remember, they'll feel it, the knowing, the silence, the shift. Because you weren't just right, you were inevitable. And now, they'll never see intuition the same way again.